let's uh let's get started, you guys. We have a
Cool.
lot to cover today. I'm super excited to talk to our guest, Meghann Misiak. And the reason why I wanted to get Meghann on the webinar today is that um, I've worked alongside her quite a bit, and she's actually helped me a ton with my discovery. So I've been able to level up my chops talking to Meghann and just consuming your content. And just a little quick background, she runs a company called the Path to President's Club. And what she's spent the last 5, 6 years doing is building sales training and enablement programs for MarTech companies. So companies like NewsCred, Movable Ink, she works with really large sales teams, helps them with that middle funnel, discovery. Medic is something that you talk about a lot, Meghann. And overall, she's just kind of a badass. Okay, so I'm excited to have you, Meghann.
Yeah, excited to be here. Always a pleasure to train together.
So before we get in, we got a bunch of folks here. Thanks for saying hi, everyone. A couple of quick kind of things that we want to do. One, if you have questions that come up, use the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom there, and that way we can kind of filter out your questions from the chat and get to them. And the second thing that we want to do real quick is we're going to cover her discovery process, but we want to customize the content a bit for you. So I got a poll that I'm going to launch. And I'd love for you to take a second. What are your biggest discovery challenges? So, your single biggest challenge, mark that off in the poll there so we can get a better idea of where you're having the biggest challenges. And I don't, Megan, does it allow you to see the poll or?
Yeah,
Yeah, it does. Okay.
I tried to select one for myself. It wouldn't let me, but even the trainers, we have our own challenges.
Yeah. So, it looks like discovery meetings or demos that don't convert is a big one that will let you know if we're interested.
Oof, it's a
Yeah,
rough
we'll take a
one.
couple more seconds here. Yeah, let us know in the poll, you guys. What's your biggest single challenge in discovery for you?
Can I ask you what yours is from your discovery?
Ooh, um, I would say the biggest one for me of these, probably getting more senior people on the next call.
Honestly,
That's
that's
a
mine
tough
as
one.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of times we, especially with the larger companies, I have a lot of enablement people that reach out to me
Yep.
when I want to be talking to the head of sales, the CRO, and every all of these people think that they're champions, and a lot of times like we can't get budget. So
Yeah.
my personal one.
Yeah. I'm excited to dig into that one because that's kind of, I teach a lot of outbound, but I get a lot of inbound requests, and the inbound
Yeah,
request is never from a VP of sales. It's always someone working directly with the
yeah,
team and that sort of here. Let me end the poll so that people can see
cool.
it.
Yeah, wow, pretty much those first two. Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful.
So good. We're definitely going to be covering those topics, Megan.
Yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely.
let's let's kind of start bigger picture. What when we're doing discovery, let's start with where do you see in the work that you do, where do you see people making the biggest mistakes? Like what are some of the big things that when you work with a team of people or individuals, what kind of big mistakes are they typically making that's making it harder than it needs to be?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. I think that the most obvious for people is that they're talking too much. So much of training focuses on this, where
Yeah.
limiting talk time and really going beyond presentations, and even from the outside looking in, so many times people are just overly relying on presentation decks. And the thing that I want to highlight is that while that, of course, is a huge issue, I think it even goes beyond that. I think that one of the first issues is that we're just being too selfish in discovery. We show up to the meeting and we're like, okay, I need to qualify. I need to show you all my presentation decks. It's like the only thing we're interested in is getting what we want out of the conversation. And if you can imagine, that's like people don't want to be a salesperson. They have this like huge aspect of them, like, or perception of them, that's selfish and salesy. So for
Hmm.
me, I think that being salesy, like when we really focus on an adversarial relationship where you're just getting everything you can out of the prospect, versus an aligned approach, which is what I take, where it's human, it's having a conversation. It's also like very aligned and fair. It's like, hey, let's figure out if this makes sense for both of us and then move forward.
So it's kind of this, what I'm hearing is this mentality coming into the call that I need
Yeah.
to qualify, basically. I need to make sure this is a good fit before I spend a bunch of time, and I'm going to spend more time asking the BANT style questions, right? The budget, is this the right person? Do they have a
Yeah.
need? All of that kind of stuff.
or
Um,
or like you feel like you have an entire presentation deck because you created it, you spent so much time focusing
yeah.
on like on the process versus what you want to accomplish through the process. I call this like focusing too much on how versus what. This is
Okay.
a lot of times what I see when people start to go into discovery. They're like, okay, I need to ask open-ended questions, I need to do this discovery flow, but you don't focus on, again, like what all of those strategies are actually working towards. Because if you just focus on the outcomes of discovery more than the process, a lot of times the process actually even flows more easily.
Okay, let's dig in because I just wrote a post
Yeah.
about that yesterday, just promoting this webinar. This how versus what concept is kind of interesting because the the prospect kind of comes to you. We did this together, but you really, if we're being honest, did about three-quarters of the work with when we
No,
put together a
no.
presentation with a sales call. Yeah. So one of the things that this how versus what concept is kind of interesting because when a prospect comes to you, they care a lot about how to fix the problem. They'll
Yeah.
come to you and say something like sales training. We need a sales trainer because we're not converting like our people don't know how to do discovery well, or we're not closing enough work. Like they've already identified what they think is the solution to their problem. And is it kind of stepping back then and thinking about, well, what are you trying to accomplish first? Is that the difference between the two before you go in and talk about the solution and all the other stuff?
Yeah, and I think setting expectations is a really big part of it. So even in the comments, someone mentioned like, I found I can't always like get all of the things I need out of a 30-minute call. And
Yeah.
so yeah, like setting expectations is the very first step. And I personally have found that even if you just set expectations for what the call will be, like what you'll cover, what you won't cover, even what you may need to push to the next meeting. I think so many salespeople, we try to fit every single thing in a discovery call, but
Yeah.
it's okay if they we have to leave something for the next call, because we're also like almost building something for the we're building a business case and building interest. Like we want to leave them wanting more. So it's interesting because so many salespeople try to focus on the perfect talk track, the perfect, um, the perfect questions, and all these things. And while those things are very valuable, most of the time we just try to have control over the conversation. And the thing is, with discovery, you really can't control as much as like we don't want to control. We want to have a really good conversation, and we want to make sure that we're focusing on the most important things. And if that means sacrificing, like leaving a few things for the next meeting, it's actually good because it means that, well, they're
Yeah.
interested in a next meeting.
Interesting. So we're kind of essentially we want to put up some bumper guards, so to speak, to where
Yeah.
we kind of know where the conversation is going to take place and we're able to keep it on track, but we're not talking the entire time. We're not controlling that call. So
Yeah.
what are we trying to accomplish during discovery? And if you could kind of maybe comment also on, and you might be getting to this, so let me know if I'm skipping
Yeah.
ahead. I think a lot of people want to know how long should the call be too?
Yeah.
Is it 30 minutes? Is it 45 minutes? Is it an hour? I'm sure that depends on the deal, your average deal size and that sort of thing. But what are we trying to accomplish in that first call when we
Yeah.
talk to?
So I'm gonna start with the what I see people doing. When I
Yeah,
usually come into organizations, they're often doing anywhere from like, I've even seen like 15-minute discoveries, which is just like qualification. Honestly, you only really
yeah,
have time to qualify. But I
yeah,
see a lot of people doing a standard 30-minute discovery and pushing back on me when I try to urge them towards what I think, which should be like a 60-minute discovery. But let me tell you why. Um, I have found that when you incorporate value-based discovery that's really focused on alignment, you set very clear next steps, expectations around why you need the time, and you're focusing on the value versus the time commitment, then it actually really it is a lot easier to get a 60-minute presentation. And before you say, okay, our prospects don't have time for that, I've literally sold into companies like American Express, Home Depot, and I always leveraged 60-minute presentations. So why you need that time is because deals are literally won and lost in discovery. So if you
Mhm.
do not, I mean, Jason, you focus a lot on prospecting, and you know how hard it is. You spend weeks, months, years getting a meeting. If you're not spending enough time uncovering the right thing so you can actually get the next meeting, you're wasting a lot of time, especially because in terms of like how long it could take you to re-engage them, often it's like between 3 months on the low end and up to two
Yeah.
years on the high end. So when we think about really what we want to accomplish, it's easy three questions. Why change? Why you? And why now? That is completely how my discovery flow is arranged. And if you focus on answering those three questions, even in your notes, like what questions are you asking? And I would actually say those personally, that I think they are linear and answering one at a time. These
Mhm.
are very easy. Like this, everything flows a lot more easily when you focus on answering those three questions. However, you'll realize that most sellers, they're only focusing on like maybe one question around why change. They uncover surface level pain and they immediately jump to why you. And a lot of times they don't even focus on why now, which is incredibly important to make sure we're actually driving urgency.
Yes, I love this. That's just conceptually for me, that's changed a lot in how I look at even outbound because you're really
Yeah.
like people are taking care of whatever it is that you can help with. They're already doing something to take care of that,
Yeah.
usually, right? They're doing it themselves, they have another solution, whatever it might be. And it's probably getting the job done for the most part. There might be some problems and stuff that they're having, but everyone's thinking, well, why should I? The change is really hard. Why should
Yeah.
I consider doing something different? So, so with Discovery, you're recommending that you block off an hour for it. And is there any kind of pre-call prior to that to see if it makes sense to spend an hour with someone?
Yeah, and there's also a question in the chat in terms of like clarifying those questions. So we can definitely dig into that and then even figure out like, okay, how can you uncover these questions
Yeah.
starting with before the meeting? Because let's be real, as much as you can do before the meeting to prepare and also to uncover information, the more that you're going to be able to optimize the time. So when we say why change, why you, why now, what we mean is why change. A lot of times we're like, okay, like what are the goals you want to accomplish? But change, I love what you mentioned. Change is hard and people are adverse to it.
Yeah.
And I don't know about, the average sales cycle of of the people on the call, but I would say a lot of times the companies I work with, the average sales cycle can be between 3 months and 8 months. And it is really easy for someone on a first call where it's more exploratory to say, yeah, we want all of this. This is really cool and fun and innovative and awesome.
Yeah.
And when I hear people using those terms to describe their solution, I get really worried because a lot of times, there's a psychological um, framework called loss aversion, where
Yep.
it states that people are more likely to make change to avoid a loss or pain than to achieve a gain. And why that's important is because, again, when you think about committing to something, getting the client to not only commit to evaluating you and starting the process, but to literally go through the painful process of changing, you need to make sure that you discover enough from the very beginning so that because it's really hard when you're in negotiation and they're like, oh, they're kind of like backing away and they're like, oh, this is way more painful than I thought. I have to get legal involved. I have to go through even the process of
Yep.
procuring a solution is challenging. So you want to make sure that you have a really compelling reason for that why change. And by the way, it's not just because they want to, like sometimes I've literally, in terms of, actually we can even dive into a few examples from like what we hear as sellers. And I mean, we're salespeople ourselves. So when I ask people why they reached out to me, a lot of times they say, well, we need sales training. I don't know if you hear that, Jason. They're like,
Yep.
we don't have sales training and we need sales training. And I could stop there and I'm like, okay, they need sales training. They need deal qualification. Awesome. Let's do this. Let me get you a proposal. But when you start digging deeper into why, like what is the sales training going to be solving? What are the deeper challenges? What could go wrong? Like what with training and really getting them to think about all of those challenges. I'm also going to just highlight that that can be very challenging in the process. We just talked about how, I mean, I work a lot with enablement, and sometimes even sales enablement doesn't know the broader challenges of the sales leadership team. Sometimes they have more of a RevOps hat. Like everyone has a hat that they're wearing. So really helping them map those initiatives, it can be a, a challenging process, but it is critical. I'm doing a proposal this afternoon where I literally sent them like a list of metrics, and they really like didn't have a lot. So I set the expectation that that they would go to different team members and get some perspective on that. And through that process, they were actually able to help me map it. But it takes a lot of collaboration, and this is actually why it's so important to have that um, collaborative alignment based approach to discovery and to sales as a whole. Because if you're trying to like compete, or not even compete, like if you're trying to have this relationship that's transactional with your champion and with your discovery as a whole, you're probably just like racing to deal close or them ghosting you. Discovery
Yeah.
takes a lot of work.
Well, and this is a good kind of this part gets me fired up because a lot of people complain about ghosting and what do I do when I get ghosted?
Yeah.
You just highlighted the reason why. If you can't pinpoint and go back to a problem they're trying to solve that's been quantified, where the example I always give is, people want more meetings when that's essentially the outcome that they want from me. How do we get more meetings so that we can close more deals? And
Yeah.
if we haven't quantified your team on average per person is setting 7 meetings a month and you need to get to 10, and that gap is going to create one more closed deal, per month, and that's going to be an extra 300K that our team needs to close that gap, and we know the reasons why. It's like now we have a problem that's costing them $300,000 a month to fix.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, you can't really follow up with people. It doesn't make sense to schedule the next meeting because sales training sounds like a nice shiny object, like really fun thing. We're going to train our reps.
Yeah.
But if there isn't that compelling reason, like you said, the why change, like behind it, you're not going to be able to get senior people involved.
Mm-hmm.
If
Yeah.
you go to reach out to someone that's ghosted or whatever, following up about sales training is very different than following up about a $300,000 per month problem.
Mm-hmm.
So let's dig into that, kind of part. So we have the why change, why you, why now. Does it make sense to kind of go through the flow of
Yeah.
the call? And do you want to start quickly with, maybe how do we set the agenda? And then how
Yeah.
do we kind of get into these? And what are some examples of how we can start to kind of poke and prod, I guess, around the why change, why you, why now? And we can give people some examples of what that sounds like.
Yeah. So you asked earlier as well about pre-call planning. So I do think that it is really important to figure out what you want to achieve out of the call. And when I say that, a lot of people focus on, oh, that is the agenda. But I think that really the what where we should be focusing on, an exercise I do with some of the teams I work with, is actually going beyond like figuring out, okay, what is the agenda? But more importantly, what are the outcomes for you as a salesperson? And what are the outcomes for the prospect on the other end of the call? And when I say the outcomes, I can say like ideal outcomes, but also what are the things that they always show up to the call expecting? And
Mhm.
through that exercise, then you can figure out how you can actually set expectations that not only discuss what you want to achieve out of the call for them, but you're kind of working in some objection handling as well. So for me, what that looks like is the agenda is we're going to run through a quick round of introductions. You're probably going to have questions for me. I have some questions for you. And my goal for by the end of the meeting is for us both to understand if it makes sense to move forward. If we do think that it does make sense, then typically the next step would be a deeper call where we dive into the metrics. We might need an NDA for that conversation, so we'll get that in place. And that will allow us to build out a custom solution so that we can then price that. Does that sound fair? And built into that are a few objection handling techniques. So typically when I ask, we figure out clients, well, like what clients want, the misalignments happen because clients typically, I mean, it can be a lot of different things, but I see on average they want like a demo on the first call. I'm not going to give a demo on the first call. I hope people aren't giving a demo on the first call. Um, they want pricing on the first call.
Yeah.
And they thought like even when they want a flow that feels conversational, not just too much of you just like going through what feels like clinical list of questions. You show up to the doctor and they're like, okay, like what is this, what is that, do you have this, do you have, like, you're answering questions. They don't want that, they want a conversation.
Yeah.
So that's where I also see some people, clients giving feedback in discovery, the dreaded, hey, I'm sorry, I thought I was here to learn about you and your company. Can you like get to that? Where's your presentation deck? So
Yeah.
setting really clear expectations and working in some of those client objections can be really helpful for making sure you can actually achieve the objectives.
I want to, okay, so the highlights there are I'm going to have some questions for you. You're going to have some questions. So you're letting them know in advance that we'll get to answer your questions, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And then you're talking about what the next step will be. And these are very simple things, by the way, that when I
Yeah.
listen to most discovery calls, people don't talk about what's going to happen at the end.
Yeah. And by the way, it's honestly, people feel very psychologically safe when they
Yeah.
know what to expect and they know exactly what's coming. They just want to know that, like, okay, even working in things like I also will leave some space for technical questions, but I do want to highlight, even if your next step typically is a deeper technical conversation, setting the expectation that, hey, my goal for the end is simply for us to understand if we should have that technical meeting. Because we have only 30 minutes today, I usually just start a list of technical questions that if we do need to park any of them, so that we can cover those in the next meeting. Because
Yeah.
so many times calls get, like, figure out why calls get derailed, and then figure out workflows to make sure that you can actually push them to the next meeting, so that you can actually, if you see your 15 minutes into a 30-minute call and you haven't answered any of these questions, you can feel comfortable parking those questions and saving them for the next conversation.
Yeah, I love this idea. You shared this on a podcast we did together too, the
Yeah.
parking lot, kind of thing where it's I'm acknowledging you when you have something that you want to talk about that we're not going to talk about on this call. I have to acknowledge you. Otherwise, it feels like I'm just like rejecting you, you know?
Yeah.
Like you
And
don't want the
it's
person to feel like you're shooting down what they're saying and that they don't feel important. It's like, hey, that's a really great question, Megan. I'm actually going to make a list. I have a list going and I have a few other
Yeah.
things. It's definitely something we can cover on the next call when we do that deeper demo or technical discussion or whatever that next step is. And I think, by
Yeah.
the way, Megan, for context for you, I think a lot of folks, at least coming from my audience too, are going to be maybe mid-market as well.
Yeah.
So the second call is probably going to be a demo, I think, for
Yeah.
a lot of folks.
Exactly.
Um,
So it's even like on the demo, it's an incredible opportunity when they're like, hey, can you tell me a little bit more about this? You're like, I think using the improv technique of yes and, yeah,
yeah.
I would be happy to talk to you about that. why don't we, just for the sake of the time today, why don't we actually take that down, and that could be a key area of focus on our demo. We can actually build you out even some more custom information. So using like yes and techniques are a really valuable way of, giving the client what they want, which is like a big pushback I get from people who are like, well, my client wants to see a demo or they need to hear pricing. They don't need those. Like, they want to make sure that they have a basic understanding, but they're usually happy when you give them expectations for when you're going to cover that.
Yeah, I don't ever get resistance on the first call about if someone asks about pricing at the, I'll be pretty blunt with them in most cases, but um, I've never had anyone ask me to, I don't have software that I demo. There's kind of different parts. There's like, hey, here's the course you get. Here's how the training works. Here's the training content.
Yeah.
I don't really have people ask that at all when you set a good expectation at the beginning. But Jennifer
Yeah.
Curland has a question I think that would be good
Yeah.
to answer. I have no demo on the first call.
So, why no demo on the first call? Because okay, there's so many reasons. The thing is, for me, when you think about a demo, like what really is a demo? A demo should be, in my opinion, it should be why you. If you're telling them why you before you understand what they're trying to accomplish, it's kind of like asking someone to marry you before you even know them. Like, it's a big commitment, and it usually means that if you're doing that before you uncover the information, unless you're in a very transactional environment where your solution is honestly pretty cut and dry, where there's no customization. And honestly, even in that environment, like, we should still be doing a little bit of discovery.
You have
But
to. Yeah.
yeah, but the thing is, and I think that the issue is that a lot of people try to do either or, where they're like, okay, I'm only going to ask discovery and give them nothing about my product or my solution or what I do in the very first call. It's not either. So even I think this is a good conversation to kind of lead into how to apply the three whys, because we need to find that balance. Really, yeah, someone, even Peter mentioned in the chat, like, we need to make sure that we even know what to demo, and that's a good way to push back on prospects. But the thing is, with a demo on the first call, usually especially if you only have a 30-minute call, you're not going to have as much ability to even gather information about how to tie what you're showing back to them.
Yeah.
So I
That's the
think
worst
that's,
feeling as a seller, right? Is
yeah,
when you're presenting something and you don't even know if that's what the people want to see. I hate that. It's the worst feeling ever.
yeah.
If
And
I feel like I'm pitching something that is just not even important to the person that I'm talking to.
yeah. So, I think that the easier way to even show this is not to like slap someone on the wrist and say like, don't do a demo on the discovery, but actually show you what it could look like to really tie in, to really take, hey, this is what we do, into really why change, and actually why you. Not only what you do, but like why you are the best solution that fits their needs. And the easiest thing, like, you need to uncover their needs in order to actually answer that question.
So what do you say, Megan? Because I think some people are kind of commenting on this too, and they might be wondering. So you do your agenda, you set the agenda, and what if someone's like, "Well, Megan, I was kind of hoping that we'd get a demo today of the product." What do you say?
It's honestly so simple. It's yes and. This is like, it seems like such a weird way to answer this, but I literally say, hey, really happy to like, really excited to show you the demo. So why don't we look at our schedules? Let's go ahead and get that demo scheduled. And then before the demo, we just need to have a really quick conversation to make sure that we understand what to show in the demo. Why don't we get that scheduled as well?
Yeah.
The
And
magic
then
of that is that you're literally scheduling the next steps before the discovery call. So it actually is saving a process. If they want to see the demo, that's great. And then you just go ahead and say, hey, in order to do that demo, we also need a discovery call. So let's just schedule that. Then you basically schedule two meetings in one, and you actually skip the next, like, skip even having a step focus on the next steps because you already have them booked.
I love that. What about
It's
in the actual
simple and it works. Yeah.
what if they ask you in the disco call at the beginning of the disco call? And they say, "Hey, one of the questions," because you asked them if they have any questions. Well, one of the
Yeah.
questions I had is just how the product works, Megan. I was hoping that we could see the product today.
Yeah, so I think that a few people mentioned it in the chat, but that
Mhm.
comes up all of the time. And again, just leaning in with yes and saying, hey, um, typically when people want to see the product on the first call, it means that they're really eager to see how it works, to see a few use cases. And so I'm actually happy to talk through a few ways that clients are using our solution. The only thing I want to uncover today is we have our platform, our demo, whatever our solution is pretty extensive and very custom. Even if it's like fairly simple, you can still use this.
Yeah.
Saying we could show a lot of different things. So what I want to actually share with you today is a few stories that will actually help me focus on what to dive into more deeply on the next call. Is that fair? And Jason, you already mentioned you're like, I usually don't get a lot of
Yeah.
pushback on those talk tracks. And I don't know if anyone else does. But I think that like even anticipating that question and having a really solid yes and talk track, that's actually one thing I think is really valuable. I know we haven't even talked about like the ideal flow, but one thing that I always have sales reps do, because people really have this like need to feel control, is to prepare for the unexpected.
Hmm.
It is, I do a lot of role plays with new sales hires, and the thing is that when they prepare for these role plays, they always prepare the talk tracks. They prepare the perfect situation. In a perfect world, when clients have no objections, no misalignments on the expectations, no questions that derail the process, this is what it would look like. What percentage of your sales calls, Jason, go like that?
Uh, I mean, they tend to flow the way that I want to, but in terms of, yeah, it goes in a different direction almost every single
Yeah.
time. The
Like
person has
when
something different that they want to get from the call.
yeah, when you have something that is like unexpected, even if it's just like a weird question or someone that doesn't show up, that or someone that does show up, so the thing that I always have people do is to actually prepare for the unexpected, really think about and be very proactive about like what are the misalignments that I get most often. People that want to show pricing, see pricing, people that like the thing is, instead of treating these as like reasons to not opt into this process or to give the client what they want, think about these as just common objections, common questions that you just want to prepare for. How can you actually prepare responses in advance that are, yes and techniques that
Yeah.
will help you stay on track with your agenda versus derail it?
Yeah. I
We've
love
gone
that.
we've gone a lot like we've gone a lot around the
Yeah.
agenda. I don't know if you want to just jump to like what
Yeah.
the recommended looks like.
Yeah. Let's just jump into it.
Cool. So, in terms of the discovery flow that I recommend, just for some context, I use the deal qualification framework that's pretty complex. It's called MEDIC. And it really is just based in why change, why you, why now. And you actually see like the flow of it following. So, for me, I start with an upfront contract, which is basically the talk track that I mentioned earlier. An upfront contract is a Sandler sales training technique, and it basically uses the psychological phenomenon that states that people are more psychologically primed to commit to something bigger if they commit to something smaller earlier on.
Mhm.
So, an upfront contract is literally setting the expectations for the call, saying, kind of like laying out the terms of the call, if you want to think about it in that way. So, the terms are, hey, this is the agenda. These are my outcomes. What are your outcomes? And if we achieve those mutual outcomes, would it be fair to move forward with this next step? And getting them to commit to that by saying, hey, is that fair? And
Yep.
that works very well. And for me, I actually see it like really priming people to you can even see them relax when you use this technique. People feel really, they're like, okay, perfect. I know exactly what is going to happen today. And even when you ask people for their timing, like, hey, do we still have 30 minutes? They're like, oh yeah, like I actually heard someone call. There's like, I actually only have 26 minutes. You're like, thank God I
Yeah.
didn't leave the next steps for the last 4 minutes of the call, you know?
Yeah.
So just even using upfront contract, I think, this is pretty simple, simplistic strategy, but it really sets the expectations for the call. Then, and actually even before that, like I think that the typical agenda is setting expectations and getting them to commit to the outcomes, then going into why change. So really focusing on high level pain, gain, and the impact. Then I think even about scoping a little bit. So in terms of, I think this is where the why you, really figuring out a few things once you figure out why change, jumping into just as like honestly enough about the product and the solution so that you know what to dive more deeply into on the next call. And for me, I actually look at this as like, how can we get them to be excited about 3 use cases,
Mm-hmm.
and then using the next steps to as an excuse to uncover why now. And I think about this as 4 steps to simplify it a little bit. I always think about how can I qualify, quantify, scope, and prioritize. And I'll put that in the chat. And the thing is, if you find this a little bit hard to remember, if you're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to like on the fly ask questions like this? That is the point. We've talked about how a lot of times discovery can be all over the place. It's complex. So I don't rely on myself to remember any of this. I have a horrible memory, and I'm not one of those people that just like shows up into sales and is like selling $1 million contracts off the bat. Like I took a lot of time to learn sales and to honestly to mature my technique. So I find it easiest to actually set these up, even focus on why change, why you, why now, in a notes template that helps me almost like serve as a checklist. I put my questions in. I even put the questions next to the area where I have space for notes. And I really figure out the flow and remind myself constantly in the meeting what I'm trying to achieve. And that's how, again, it's like making it easier to focus on the outcomes versus actually even like making the how really easy.
And we're going to share that with you guys at the end, by the way. So,
Yeah.
okay, let's dig into this why change, the gain, pain, impact. You have a
Yeah.
really kind of pretty simple way to segue into that. So, what
Yeah.
happens right after you share the agenda, you get the buy-in? How do you start digging into the why change piece, and what are some ways that you can get people talking about what they're working on and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff?
So the funny thing is that it actually starts even before the agenda. I think about discovery as real estate, especially if you only have 30 minutes. You need to
Mhm.
maximize every single question and every single minute of that meeting. And where I see a lot of people wasting time is in the introductions. I see people sometimes like, and not that this is necessarily bad, but I think it's just kind of a wasted opportunity, is asking like, oh, like tell me about yourself. What if your prospect tells you like, oh, I don't even know, like I like poetry or something. You're like, okay, cool, I'm gonna put that in Salesforce and like maybe send them a poetry book. But also it is like, while it's a good opportunity to build rapport, it's actually an even better way to jump into value from the very first minute. In the first question you ask is something I call roles and goals.
Yep.
When you ask a person to introduce themselves, just be more prescriptive and say, hey, let's start with a quick round of introductions. You can start with your intro and say, can you tell me more about your role and some of your key goals for the next 2 years? It's super high level, it's really broad, and it's really easy.
Yeah,
So
I love this question, by the way. What do people
yeah,
typically answer, by the way, when you coach this? What do people typically answer with?
super specific information about their role and their key goals for the next like 2 years. And like, you're just like, it was that easy. And it's funny because people always ask me, what, in terms of their roles and goals, they ask me, well, like, doesn't that take up a lot of time in the beginning of the call? Aren't like introductions like a third of the call if it's a 30-minute call? And you're like, yeah, you're literally using a third of the call to uncover the most important question. because if they tell you their key goals, then you can transition into some of the challenges when you actually start to ask, like get into the meat of the meeting. So you're already just starting with a really important assessment of the things that they're focused on, and it just opens up. It again, it's such an efficient way of starting with value.
And this is where do you want to start to do some like quantification of what they're trying to? So, for example, a person says, that I'm selling to, oh, our CRO just set these revenue goals, and based on the funding that we have, and like with our, investors, we're trying to hit XYZ revenue mark. So we need to hire X amount of people to do that, et cetera. And is this where, because some people were asking about metrics and
Yeah,
KPIs, and is this where you just kind of simply ask, oh, how are you measuring that, whether that you're hitting that goal or not? How do you measure success? Is there is
yeah,
there any other advice you have around how do we kind of quantify the stuff that they're working on?
yeah,
And I want to highlight, by the way, this is the key to discovery, is this piece. Everything has to tie back to their goal, priority, initiative, what projects. Those are the things that can create urgency,
yeah,
for folks. But so how do we get people to quantify or give us metrics, and why is that
yep.
important?
So, and I think you even asked the question originally is like, so when the first question you ask, roles and goals, is that when you like dive in? Um, the thing is, because I use roles and goals as literally my first question when I'm like, hey, welcome to the meeting, like, let's do some introductions. And I usually maybe ask one qualifying question or like clarifying question, but then I go into okay, thank you so much for sharing. We're going to dive into that a little bit more deeply, but let's just start with a context setting agenda, because I usually do like, because we were giving kind of the elevator pitch, people like context before they like to like dive into the details. They like to know like, okay, like what do you do again? And like, can you tell me a little bit about yourself before they know how to answer your questions deeply? So I do use roles and goals, then do the upfront contract, and then give like a tiny elevator pitch about the solution so they have enough context to even understand what they should be including or like why they should be answering your questions and in what context. And then this is such a common question. How do you actually get them to give you meaningful, high level, and broad pain, gain, and impact? Because so many times I see people simply asking, hey, can you tell me like, what are your, like, oh God, or the dreaded, like, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah.
Um, when you ask these like really like questions, you don't even know what, like, you get so many different types of responses. But for me, what I see a lot of times happening is that they're just more lower level responses. So what I would recommend is the easiest way to dive into meaningful and diverse goals and pains and being able to quantify them. Actually, we can focus on quantification in 1 minute. I use a strategy called value drivers.
Mm.
And to simplify this, the thing that you need to understand, like this is kind of a sales hack, most of the value that any company, whether it's our training or a SaaS solution, like what, no matter what it is, most value fits into 4 buckets. And if you can kind of figure out how to customize these to your prospects, your clients, um, it's really easy way to actually play this back and then dive in. So most clients are looking to increase revenue. Even if they're a nonprofit, they're looking to increase donations, increase brand loyalty and brand value. So that could be like streamlining the customer experience or increasing the amount of spend per clients that are existing clients, like whatever that is. Even brand awareness and perception, critical. Third is operational efficiency and effectiveness. They're trying to do those 2 things, but like also do it in a scalable way. And fourth is they're trying to mitigate risk and manage compliance. So to figure out how to kind of use those in discovery to uncover goals and pain, I typically say very simplistic, hey, most of my clients are trying to achieve like one of 3 things. I don't even focus on risk and compliance because it's not as big to usually, a company will have 3 out of the 4 that they focus on primarily. And I
Yeah.
say, typically, people are trying to do 3 things with me. They're trying to increase their overall revenue and the sales performance. They're trying to increase rep quota attainment and rep engagement. And they're trying to be able to effectively scale the teams through both onboarding and new and promotions from within. I'm curious how your own goals compare to those. And people like, I've literally had like their response is like, all 3. And you're like, okay, that's good. But when I ask like, hey, what are some of your goals? Again, in roles and goals, it's usually more specific. So you see how if I even just ask them more broadly, hey, what are you focused on? It's just like, okay, like where do I start? So if you can actually use a talk track or use even a slide if you have a presentation to play those to the customers and then ask them to compare their own goals, it is a huge opportunity to have something to reference so you can dig deeper, because what I find is that it's a lot easier to give them some options, and especially because a lot of clients, like, they're just thinking they're wearing their hat. So one of those goals is likely most important to them. But when you actually start playing them broad, high level goals, they're like, oh yeah, like I actually had this with my proposal I'm presenting today. The head of enablement was like, my primary goal is to launch a deal qualification framework. And I'm like, okay, well, like, what's driving that? They're like, oh, well, I just launched a new sales process and I want to make sure like no one's following it. And I'm like, okay, well, what happens when people don't follow the process? And he was like, well, and he had to think about it for a minute. But he was like,
Yeah.
honestly, what happens is that like the sales and CSMs are really misaligned. And I'm like, okay, well, like what happens when like what part of the process is typically broken? He's like, the handoffs. When we have to hand off from sales to CS, there's a ton of misalignment. And I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean for the clients? And he was like, well, the clients typically have they they're really frustrated. They have to give information twice. They usually, and I was like, ooh, that doesn't sound good. And he's like, yeah, usually it means they don't see ROI as fast. And I was like, what does that mean for first year contracts? He's like, well, most of the time they don't renew as quickly. It usually takes them 2 years to renew. And again, I'm going pretty fast, but to kind of show you the process, he was like, okay. I asked, what would it mean if you were able to actually not only renew and but also upsell clients much faster because they saw the streamlined, we had more streamlined handoffs, and they just had a better overall client score, client NPS. He's like, that would be huge. And I even said, well, also I just want to highlight that a lot of my clients also focus not only on client health but deal health with qualification. So I'm also curious, like, what it would look like if your clients came in healthier, not even before the handoffs. What would happen if you were able to? And I was like, what would it even mean for clients to be healthier? He's like, oh, well, if the deals are healthier, then they would just land with more products. And you could see the wheels turning where he's like, oh, okay. I know that the CEO is really upset with the client handoffs. He's like, yeah, you should put that. Like, he's like, also, we have this initiative. I didn't even think about connecting it to this, but we have an initiative for client health that is known within the entire organization. And the head of sales specifically is going to be really interested in his big pain point right now is internal alignment. So you see how, asking, like, playing some of those core metrics in the value drivers to my champion got me from, we need deal qualification because I just launched a project, to actually figuring out why that project was even launched and what broader initiatives and personal initiatives of the senior stakeholders it mapped to. So
Yes. I love that.
I know this is something we've been geeking out a lot on.
Yeah, I want to go back because Lisa in the chat said often
Yeah.
IT people start with their projects and not higher level goals. You
Yep.
basically gave a blueprint of that's great. Get them to keep talking about that project and why it's important. How does it fit into the bigger picture? And it's because you know that this is now an initiative from the CEO. You know that there's a company-wide initiative around customer health coming in,
Yeah.
and you know that you can quantify and start to create a business case for how much would this grow revenue if people came in more primed and ready to buy more stuff from us because they were having a better experience. It's like
Yeah.
those are all people are not going to ghost you when you're talking about something that relates to a priority across the entire company that the CEO is focused on. They're just not going to ghost you.
Yeah, and I also want to highlight. I think as new salespeople, you're hearing me ask questions that I will say are fairly complex and rely on specialty within my industry. But the cool thing about value drivers for me, especially when I'm going into like a new company where I don't know those questions, like those more complex questions to ask,
Mm.
even showing them, hey, these are the 4 areas that we drive value, giving them something that you don't even have to remember, even if you kind of like write out those talk tracks, it's actually easier to for new salespeople. So it's actually one of those hacks that is easier because it doesn't rely on you having to like ask deeper questions. It's really just like showing them something and having them respond to it, and then just asking deeper questions. Like, I think I can share with one of my favorite frameworks for asking better questions is really easy. TED, tell me, explain to me, and describe to me. You can just ask, kind of play some things back to them and then ask them to dive deeper. It's a really easy way to just get them talking more, to lower your talk time, to uncover more, and to
Yeah.
make sure that you're actually able to uncover why change, why you, and why now.
Yeah. I love that. Let's get
Yeah.
to, because we got about 5 minutes left.
Yep.
Let's see if we can get to a couple of questions. Jennifer Kurland,
Yeah.
she's got great questions today. She asked, how do you feel about sharing a range of pricing during discovery? We often use that to further qualify the prospect.
Yeah, so I think this question is very specific because I'm going to give you kind of like the best practice and then just like the reality. Starting with the reality is that your sales manager will have very specific opinions on how he or she wants you to share pricing on a first call. So I would actually align with sales leadership on that. But from my perspective, I actually, when people ask me for pricing on the first call, the yes and approach to that, actually, let's say like the typical approach is like, hey, we can't share the information. Like, we usually take a little bit longer, etc. Yes,
Yeah.
and however, is hey, happy to give you some information on pricing. Typically, when people ask about pricing in this early in the conversation, they're really just they're wanting to understand if it's $3,000, $30,000, or $300,000. They want to know where it fits into their budget and how the pricing work. Is it subscription based? Is it programmatic, etc.? Is that fair to say? They're like, yeah, I just want like a ballpark. That's what I said. They're like, no, you asked for a price. But even understanding that and kind of playing it back, like why they would want pricing, I do think that I would first push back on them and say, hey, typically we give pricing. Our pricing is extremely custom. So normally we just need to uncover a little bit more about the use cases. This is what our pricing is based on, whatever it's like usage, number of employees, whatever. And so I think that'd actually be some good information to capture before the next call. Would you be able to put that together? And even just like pushing them to the next call.
Yeah.
But if you do want to give a range, and if your sales leadership is comfortable with that as a qualification criteria, you can do that. But I also just want to highlight that like it's also a great opportunity to actually answer with a question. By the way, like, do you have budget already built out for this? What is the budget? Whose budget will be coming from? So there's a lot of different strategies around pricing. But I think that like personally, starting with giving them information isn't where I typically start.
Yeah, I don't like it. It depends on what you're selling to, but especially at large mid-market and enterprise level, it just doesn't do you any favors to talk about pricing and be overly transparent about something that you don't even know. Like you don't know really what the range could be because you don't
Yeah.
know the use cases, but you could also, if you're talking to someone that came inbound and they're just trying to talk to you to get some ranges so that they can bring it back to their boss and talk about it. When you haven't established like the why change piece, and you haven't quantified the problem, people find budget if the problem is really big. If they came
Yeah.
in and only wanted to spend $30,000 and you show them that it's like a $5 million problem, people are willing to spend more money to fix it.
And this
So you
is
kind of ruin
also
that opportunity.
this is why I do not like using BANT. I think that we as SaaS salespeople are too BANT heavy because
I
we're
hate
like,
it.
hey, do you have budget? Do you have enough? Like, do you have $30,000 to $60,000? And by the way, if I talk to most of my, and when I say my, even my last company, we budget was never built out because they like we were not replacing or an incumbent. We had to build budget. So it wasn't even an option to say like, hey, do you have $30 to $60,000 for this project? They would have been like, no. We're like, okay, bye. We would have had no deals. So I
Yep.
know that it's hard. Like it's easy to just like ask them that question and to qualify them out if they don't have that budget. But in my experience, exactly what you stated, if you can uncover the why change, you will be able to connect with senior stakeholders that do have budget or have the ability to build budget.
Yep.
Getting off of my soapbox, I wouldn't talk about pricing on the first call, but that's just my experience and opinion.
Hey, this has been really great, Megan. I want to drop in. There's a couple links. Let people know, and I'll drop these in as you're kind of talking. Where should people go to connect with you? I'm dropping in your LinkedIn
Yeah,
profile.
LinkedIn
Definitely
is
follow her.
great.
Content's great.
Yeah. And
Website.
I also just want to highlight, like, even just a plug for you, Jason, that I know we talked a lot of like verbal, people were asking, like, hey, like, can you give us the framework? This is pretty complex. Jason, we're literally doing a training tomorrow for your group where we're going
Yep.
digging deeper, giving like the full playbook or resources. So if you do want some of those resources, it's a great reason to check out Jason's program.
No, I appreciate
Shameless
that.
plug for you.
Make sure to check out. I dropped the discovery call template into there too. That document. It's a view only document, so just click on file and make a copy so you have your own. But thanks for the participation, everyone. This is really great, Megan. I appreciate you coming and spending time with us. I got a lot from this. I love this why change, why you, why now. If you can look at discovery through that lens and think about what you're trying to accomplish before you go into it, it helps really kind of drive those questions and prevents the whole ghosting thing that people are having so many challenges with. So appreciate you coming on, Megan.
Absolutely. Bye, everyone.
All right, later, everyone. Have a good one. We'll see ya.